All right, our next speaker, or our first speaker, giving a presentation is our own Abby Marino. Abby works as Conservation Area Manager for LISMA. We've met her already today. Abby has a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Cornell University, where she worked in the Blasi lab, studying invasive plant-soil interactions. Abby's work as a communications coordinator for New York Invasive Species Research Institute gave her experience in communicating invasive species research for managers and the public. In addition to Abby's work at LISMA, Abby's pursuing a master's degree in energy and environmental management from the University of Connecticut. So please welcome Abby.
Yeah, so as Bill mentioned, this is a presentation that part of this I gave during National Invasive Species Awareness Week and also at the Northeast Natural History Conference. So if any of you attended either of those, there is some new material here, looking at you, Steve Young, and probably Jen Dean heard part of this too. So protecting biodiversity in invasive species management. I think when we first think of Long Island, many of us think of it with the suburbs in mind, like houses, highways, commuting to the city, and that development does have an impact here. Many habitats are fragmented, and as people move around and settle, invasive species are often traveling with them. But at the same time, Long Island is one of the most biodiverse regions of New York State. From beaches to upland forests, wetlands, remnant plains, maritime shrubland, and rare ecosystems like coastal plain ponds, that ecological diversity, even if it's fragmented, does translate into biodiversity. And the people that do recognize this amazing biodiversity, including many people in this room, are working hard to protect it from many threats, including invasive species. Let me just try to hide floating meeting control. All right, even more we can see. So one of the reasons we focus on biodiversity in invasive species management comes from the need to prioritize. With more than 600 invasive species in our tier list, whether that's here already in the region or in the surrounding area, these have varying degrees of impact. And with New York City being a hub of activity and introductions for generations, many of them are already well established here. Whereas they might not be so much upstate New York, but they are kind of established here. At the same time, though, we have 380 state rare, threatened, or endangered species, either in the area or surrounding the area, and 55 significant ecological communities. What's more, I learned recently that in New York, 46% of those rare, threatened, or endangered species exist within 100 meters of an invasive species. So that interaction is happening all the time. With both those counts for invasive species and rare, threatened, endangered species being so high, you can't really work with one without thinking about the other. So to make the biggest impact in our management, we need to prioritize by species and by site. We look at what's new and emerging that we can catch early, and also what areas are at the highest risk of threat from invasive species, and how can we protect them? So Melody focuses a lot on that early detection and rapid response side, where I focus more on these conservation areas, but this will touch on both. So this means protecting areas of high biodiversity, and particularly areas with rare, threatened, or endangered species or threatened ecological communities. That's a nice idea, but what does it mean in practice? So these three things will kind of guide the rest of the presentation: the importance of knowing the data, connecting to the New York Natural Heritage Program, being able to measure it and track what you're protecting, and also your mindset, the leading edge, stepping away from the most invaded areas to be able to catch new infestations early on. So we'll start with the data. We connect with the New York Natural Heritage Program, and with them we have a data sharing agreement, so we can pinpoint where the rare species or communities have been noted in the past. Ahead of a field day, this looks like making a physical map to bring with us of those rare species or communities, so we can see in real time like where we are and what species are there. It helps us know where to focus. If we see an invasive plant in one of those areas, we know immediately that is a priority for management. And that's kind of with the assumption that most invasive species, invasive plants, can have a detrimental impact on biodiversity if they take over. It might take a little bit more time to become familiar with these species, but the more you know your ecological community, the more you're tuned into what might be different. That might also help you see an invasive species you're unfamiliar with, but it could also help you see maybe a native plant you're unfamiliar with, or even a rare plant. And I enjoyed, as I was learning, drawing some sketches in the field as we surveyed some rare plants around a coastal plain pond. It also helps us to be mindful of where and how we manage, such as to reduce soil disturbance or trampling of sensitive areas. And that soil disturbance element can be really important. So if you accidentally are compacting soil, overturning it, trampling things, you could be damaging the seed bank or make conditions less conducive to germination. So it's helpful with some caution. Now, this partnership with New York Natural Heritage Program can work both ways. While they give us data that helps inform our management, we could also help them survey areas that they haven't been able to access in a while, because they're based up in Albany, and to get to, the far reaches of the South Fork is quite a trip. But if we're already out there, we could help say, hey, we saw or we didn't see some of these rare plants. Now, lastly on this, we're careful not to share this data outside of our organization. That's part of the data sharing agreement. So part of protecting these rare species means protecting the data. So because some bad actors would take that data and take the plant for themselves for whatever reason. So we're careful to keep it inside our organization, but it is possible that you could create your own data sharing agreement with them to get some data for your property. There are also public sources of data in New York, which is great. Here on the slide, we have the New York State DEC Environmental Resource Mapper, which is showing significant ecological communities. And that could be a really good starting point. So while this is not pinpointing exactly where rare species are, this could help tune you into an important area to protect, or just give some further information about your site. There's also the Ecological Communities Guide of New York, which is like our Bible, to help us find what species we would expect to see in some of these communities. And that could really help us key into what native or threatened species we might expect to see there and what's characteristic of these communities. So those are really great resources I could point you to later. Wanted to touch on coastal plain ponds since we talk about them so much and we love them. So for example, we have these rare communities of coastal plain ponds, which have unique plant life due to the seasonality of water fluctuations. They're groundwater fed, and they're imperiled in New York State, which means they're very vulnerable to disappearing. When the water levels are lower, grasses and sedges will fill in that water body. And obviously when the water's higher, you have a different assemblage of species. This is home to more than 30 rare species, and pictured here are at the top, there's two carnivorous plants. There's the bladderwort or Utricularia, which is carnivorous of very small things that live in water. And there's also a sundew. It's not the rare threadleaf sundew, but it's a sundew that inhabits the shoreline and catches insects, I'd imagine, very small ones. And then at last, there is a rare Ludwigia species called globe-fruited seedbox, Ludwigia sphaerocarpa. So you've heard us talk about Ludwigia pipiloides. This is a rare one, a threatened one that we want to protect. So those are some fun plants that you might find here. And threats to these ponds include hydrology change, of course, but also exotic species. Phragmites comprises the biggest threat to this shoreline community, which is why, even though Phragmites is so widespread, we do work with it here at LISMA. Phragmites has invaded over half of the documented occurrences of coastal plain pond shores. And so we want to check these areas first for invasive species so we can protect that community. That'll be a recurring theme. Next, we're talking about measuring. We adjust our metrics to track what we're protecting. Now, it's hard to measure something that didn't happen, but that could actually be the most powerful result that you have. If you can catch a species early before it takes over, and you know what kind of ecological community it was in, what native or rare species were around, that can give some context to exactly what kind of resource you protected through your actions. And noting that down can be helpful to explain to funders and even to the public to say, our work has a bigger impact. We might have just been removing one plant, but we protected this whole area. So in this picture, Melody and Cassidy are surveying a coastal plain pond shore ahead of some Phragmites management. And again, these are very small stands of Phragmites. It's really sparse. So if it's something that's incredibly extensive, it's not something we could tackle with manual control, but in this case we can. And so before we do that Phragmites management, we want to understand what plants are on the shoreline. So we have a hula hoop survey that is pretty fun. You toss it, and then we assess the plant cover inside that hula hoop. So it gives us a chance to flex our muscles in plant identification, referencing that New York Ecological Communities Guide, what we'd expect to see there. And seeing what things are native and non-native, how much Phragmites is covering, how much native species are covering. And just by throwing this like between 10 and 20 times, you can start to get an idea of the richness of that site. And that data can help you see the impact of your management. So if your management is actually making more native cover or not, it could also help see the impact of Phragmites that's there. So if that Phragmites is just taking over more. So I stress in this not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good when you're doing this kind of measurement. Obviously, it's great to have the most robust thing you can, but it's better having it's better having some data than no data. So that is important to keep in mind. It doesn't need to be the fanciest thing. Even if it's just keeping a list of what you see, that could be a starting point for people that come after you've been doing this management. Thinking long term. Next, and for the rest of the presentation, we'll talk about the leading edge and how we're protecting biodiversity through our mindset. We're not afraid to step away from the most invaded area, and that helps us to find new and expanded populations early on. So we're going to dive into some maps. I love maps. And taking a little bit of time to make these maps can give a better idea for what to look for in the field. So I encourage you to make these your own throughout it, or use what we have already put together. It helps us direct our work, and maybe it could help in your management as well. So let's talk about the within site prioritization project, simple habitat suitability mapping, and also water body prioritization. All right, so you might have seen this image before if you've been to some of our partners meetings. We're going to start with these priority areas, and we have more than 25 priority conservation areas to protect Long Island's most important ecosystems. So this includes 12 invasive species prevention zones, or ISPZs, that's in purple, which are relatively large natural areas of high conservation value, where invasive species management is feasible and would offer the greatest benefits. And those ISPZs are grouped into 6 larger ecologically connected management complexes. So it's kind of like drawing a big circle around some of those ISPZs and saying, these have similar ecology, so we're going to treat them similarly. It also helps us to like look across boundaries to say, well, it's right outside that ISPZ, we should be paying attention to it too. So we took the ISPZs a step further to look, and these are some of them in the Pine Barrens area and also Long Pine Greenbelt there. What this map is showing are areas to focus on within those properties, those large properties, showing in green the areas that have more biodiversity, rare species, or ecological communities, and in redder shades, the areas with invasive species presences and more disturbance. So this helps us in 2 different ways by having it kind of on a red and green scale. It helps us to survey areas, to identify areas and survey them that are already of the highest quality, to check for invasive species encroachment. Like maybe we just haven't been to that area in a while and that's why there's no observations, or maybe it is a really high quality area and we want to make sure we're protecting it. On the other side, it also helps us to monitor or manage areas that we know already have invasive species and prevent their further spread. So that's kind of the more redder areas. So we want to contain that in a way. So I wanted to go a little bit into how it's made in case this is something that could be useful for your property. Get into some maps a little bit for anyone trying to develop priorities within their site. So all you need is some invasive species data, the landscape condition assessment from NYNHP, New York National Heritage Program, and then a layer that stands in for areas you would want to protect. So the invasive species data you could get from IMAP Invasives, iNaturalist, EdMaps, all of the above. You could even customize it to focus on one species of interest or all the invasive species on your property, or even by tier, if you really want to do that. And the landscape condition assessment from the New York National Heritage Program shows the gradients of disturbance across New York State and is publicly available to download. You'll see I use that in a few different maps. And lastly, for the protected areas here, I use the significant ecological communities provided to us from NYNHP. But you could think of creating your own layer for your property if you already have an idea of the high quality areas, or you could use a different data source. So then we want to make them all into raster layers, and this Euclidean distance tool is a tool that calculates the distance from whatever feature you put in. So say you could click on each cell of this raster that it makes and know exactly how far away it is from, say, an invasive species presence. So it'll kind of calculate that mathematically and give a surface of how far away everything is from the feature that you put in. Then we put it all on a scale of 1 to 10 and assign weights to the layers. And that gives us the final map. So if you're interested in making this your own, I'm happy to help. So now knowing some of the data that goes into it, you can start to see some patterns. There is more disturbance on some of the highways. Oh, cool, my mouse shows up. Some of the highways here. And those darker red points represent invasive species generally. So for example, you could also see differences between these ISPCs. The Long Pond Greenbelt is more threatened because of the development around it. It just doesn't have as much interior space to protect it. Whereas these properties have more interior space in those darker green colors, thanks to, it's just a larger area, larger surface, less boundaries. And so that's like Sarnoff Preserve. So you can take some inferences from putting this together, even beyond your site. Okay, next we'll move on to a very new project that can help direct surveying for emerging species. This is focused on perennial pepperweed or Lepidium latifolium. And in getting to the species before it becomes widespread, we can protect biodiversity, particularly on our coastlines. So for those not familiar with this plant, it's originally from Eurasia, and its impacts include, they inhabit wetland areas, especially in disturbed areas, where the dense growth can outcompete native species. It has these white diffuse flowers in the summer and tough leaves that kind of resemble marsh elder, especially when they're both pretty young and coming up. But as it grows up, oops, sorry, I thought I had another picture. As they kind of like diverge in appearance when they get older. They're kind of tough leaves as well. So it is all over the Western United States, but we do have scattered populations in the Northeast. And currently it's at West Meadow Beach and Flax Pond in the town of Brookhaven. Thought to be introduced there accidentally through horse feed because there's the stables there. And managers have been working to control the population with manual control and chemical tools upwards of a decade. We're working really hard to keep this population in check. Yes, that's where it is. That's the slide I was looking at. So you can see when it's young, it looks like just one little leaf coming up in the ground, but it becomes its own little stalk as it gets older with the flowers on top. And that's West Meadow Beach. And up here is Flax Pond. So thankfully, many researchers in the West have done the hard work of assessing its habitat requirements, and we can benefit from that research to better understand what areas it would be suitable for it here. So we have measures of habitat, landscape disturbance, and also some current observations to guide this. For habitat, we think it would be around tidal wetlands, near stream channels, also other freshwater bodies it can survive in. It's very adaptable, unfortunately. Things about its landscape, we think it would be on low slopes, low elevations, and also concavities is kind of like be able to capture any seeds that spread or rhizomes that spread. So if there's any kind of low spot in the landscape, that might be an area where it would be preferential. And lastly, on this, we have disturbance. So again, that landscape condition assessment showing areas of disturbance, and also the canopy cover. It would be expected to grow in higher light environments rather than low light environments, because it really, again, likes to be in that full sun, although unfortunately it can grow in some shade too, but we're trying with what we can here. All right, so it looks like a lot, but it's actually pretty similar to the last thing that I showed you. We're bringing a lot of data together and doing a weighted sum at the end to understand the habitat suitability on a common scale. So all of these layers are being turned into rasters and weighted and become the weighted sum at the end. So the result can be seen here. Oh, sorry. Then we have these 4 models for habitat, landscape, and disturbance and observations, which are these kind of color coded. And these will all turn into one final map at the end. This is it. So with habitat weighted the highest in this model, I put in the weights myself, and in reading the literature, the habitat requirements seemed kind of the most limiting thing, so I weighted those the highest. So with that way the highest, these coastline and stream adjacent areas have generally higher suitability across the study area. And the southwest portion of the study also has overall higher suitability due to the lower tree canopy cover in this area. So that's maybe telling, watch out there on the south shore. This map also correctly weighs areas that are known to have perennial pepperweed as high suitability, with 30 meters from the wetland boundary right here, this one right here. This is a 30 by 30 meter raster. That's in the darkest red. So again, this is where the populations already were. And thanks to the observation data, this map highlights another highly suitable area nearby, the currently infested area. And the LISMA team will survey this area this season, particularly where the Nisqually River meets the Long Island Sound. It also identifies some new areas to keep track of with this, particularly from the disturbance data. This map highlights areas on the South Shore alongside highways that cross tidal wetlands as areas of high suitability. So you can see along the Montauk State Parkway, it comes up in bright red. And that's, again, that convergence of habitat disturbance as it tags it as being a pretty suitable area. And these highlighted areas with high habitat suitability can be ideal monitoring locations for perennial pepperweed should it spread far beyond its current location. Now, knowing that it's been here for 10 years and hasn't spread that much further than that one site, which is good, we're not expecting it to go everywhere, but if it does start to spread so much farther, these would be areas where it could be so suitable and have a great time. So we're looking forward to hearing more about USGS's Inhabit tool later in this this meeting for suitability modeling. And I checked out their model for perennial pepperweed. Long Island does come up as a hotspot, but this local model can also just help give some finer resolution so they complement each other. Stay tuned. All right, so the last project to discuss is the Water Body Prioritization Project, which we've been working on with the Long Island Metro Aquatic Invasive Species Task Force. And I'm happy to say I just updated the whole model yesterday. So there'll be a QR code at the end. You can check out the latest data. Hopefully it all works. So this helps us highlight areas most in need of aquatic invasive species surveying and management. These are not the most invaded areas already, but are the areas that have the most to lose should they become invaded due to its ecological resources. This got cut off a little bit. It was supposed to be lower priority and higher priority. So the lower ones being the lighter green colors and higher priority being the darker blue colors. So the sad truth about aquatic invasive species is that once they're in a water body, they're incredibly difficult to eradicate. Much more so than perhaps terrestrial plants. So stuck between a rock and a hard place, manual control might be accessible, but not very effective or feasible depending on what you're dealing with. And chemical control might be effective, but also potentially bring off-target risks. So it's hard to make management choices. Really, the best thing we can do is to prevent their introduction entirely, or the next best thing to catch them early on. So that's what this project is aiming to give us the tools to catch these things early on. Let's seagull in here. So this model assigns points to water bodies based on their proximity to different ecological resources, with the highest scores being the highest priority for surveying. It goes up to 7 now. And it uses iNaturalist and IMAP invasive species data with a soon addition, actually now addition, of the DEC fish survey data in New York City. So this is a summary of how the points are assigned. If we're looking at, this is again Long Pond, if it's in already terrestrial priority areas like ISPZs or management complexes, there are points assigned for that. If it's close to, say, significant ecological communities or rare communities, then there's a point given for that. We think it's higher quality. If it has no invasive species detections, we actually give it a point because we want to make that a priority for surveying and say, maybe we should look here. If it has any emerging invasive species to the region, it gets a point, again, boosting it higher. And lastly, there's like a synergistic point. If there are any aquatic invasive species that are in proximity to some of these rare communities or ecological rare species, then that gets a point of invasive threat. So what we found here is that again, surprise, surprise, Phragmites is the most common threat to the highest quality areas. And another way of saying that is for the water bodies that have rare, threatened, or endangered species or significant ecological communities intersecting with an invasive species, that invasive threat one I just mentioned, Phragmites is usually the invasive species culprit. We also find here, at least in the last run of the model, that 94% of these water bodies had no invasive species detections, which before we celebrate that could probably more likely point to a potentially huge survey gap. And in addition, this model included very, very small water bodies like ponds that are on a golf course. So maybe some of those we'd be more or less concerned about, and that's why there aren't detections. But we should be looking for them. So we share these priorities with partners like towns and county parks and nonprofits, state parks, and we do surveying and coordinate management if we find something. And we found things. With this approach, we found, as I mentioned, really small stems of Phragmites, like less than 100 stems, that were previously undetected in coastal plain ponds. Nobody could know they were there. And if they were grown, they could outcompete several rare plants. Also, previously unknown populations of water chestnut that otherwise had no aquatic invasive species in it, and it's small enough to be manageable by hand over a few years. So there's the QR code. I encourage you to use this and make it yours. On that tool, there's preset filters you could use to see water bodies, if you just want to see which ones have emerging invasive species, water bodies where aquatic invasive species threaten those ecological features, water bodies with no aquatic invasive species detections. You can filter it by town, also agency, but that one, the data might not be complete. You can help me complete that data if you'd like. And plus you can click on a water body, this is a fun one, and see the whole list of aquatic invasive species that are observed there with some related data. So you click on Long Pond and you can see that somebody had a observation of Phragmites there in 2022, and you could even link back to IMAP invasives to see what that observation was. So I'm pretty proud that it does that. And other ways you can make it yours, just keeping an eye on the aquatic invasive species in your water bodies can be greatly important for early detection. Looking at the survey priorities in your region and logging what you find in IMAP invasives or iNaturalist or finding us. Not detected records are really important. So if you're out there and you say, I thought there might be water chestnut and you don't see any, that's great. And that data is vitally important. We can also help with surveying techniques if you want to learn how to do a more formal survey. And this tool and all tools are welcome to your feedback. So if there's something you want to see incorporated, something you should have done differently, definitely let me know. So to close this up, I invite us all to think bigger, more than just getting in and out in invasive species management. Keeping a curiosity for the plant and animal life around us can help protect biodiversity and in invasive species management. Being able to stop and investigate to see maybe there's something more going on at your site ecologically than just invasive species. Maybe there are water quality issues to address or deer that are having a big impact or even impacts of climate change. And when we look beyond invasive species, we might be able to learn a lot more and be better managers overall in conserving biodiversity. So thank you and open for any questions.
Just wanted to add. For more information, there's Abby's email address, abby@lisma.org. If you want any more information about those wonderful GIS applications, that's where to go.
Thank you. Well, I'm around if you need any, if you have any questions, and if there are any in the chat, I'm happy to answer them too. Yes. Yeah.
What do you recommend is the best way to get it in?
Ooh, yeah. It depends on how much of it there is. So if you're dealing with a very small stand versus a very big one, it's totally different management projects. I wouldn't really recommend trying to manually control a stand of Phragmites if it's like bigger than, ooh, it's less than you expect. Also like how dense it is. Probably like 10 by 10 meters can even be too much to control by hand, depending on how dedicated you are to digging up the rhizomes. So there are some good chemical control methods that can be used that are pretty selective if the application is done in the right way, such as like wicking or wiping herbicide on individual stems. We've seen previous projects where you can use that method and it protects the native vegetation that might even be growing underneath. So that could be something useful. And the benefit of that is if it's done at the right time of year, that herbicide or what you choose could be transported all the way to the rhizome. So that's really the big thing, is that being able to get the rhizomes impacted so it doesn't regrow over and over again. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So what do we have next?